In the dead of night, massive Russian transport aircraft cut through the darkness, their transponders deliberately switched off, following flight paths carefully designed to avoid NATO radar systems. Their destination? Tehran. Their cargo? Weapons designed not for foreign battlefields, but for crushing domestic uprising. This isn't a spy thriller. This is happening right now, and the implications could reshape the entire Middle East as we know it. While the world watches the chess match between Washington and Tehran unfold with nuclear negotiations, missile threats, and economic warfare, there's a third player moving pieces across the board that most people aren't paying attention to. Moscow has quietly positioned itself as the potential kingmaker in one of the most dangerous geopolitical standoffs of our time. And what they're doing behind the scenes is far more consequential than most realize. Picture this. It's late December 2025. Protests are erupting across Iran. Millions of people flood the streets demanding change, calling for the restoration of the monarchy.
Before we go further, I need to be clear about something. What you're seeing here is only the public layer of this story. For channel members, I break down what happens next, the timelines decision makers are actually working with, and the scenarios that won't be discussed openly. If you want access to that deeper analysis, you can join the channel by clicking the join button below.
Challenging 4 decades of clerical rule. The Iranian government is on edge. The supreme leader is reportedly preparing exit strategies. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, approximately 40 specialized armored vehicles arrive from Russia. But these aren't ordinary military vehicles. These are Spartak mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles, purpose-built machines designed specifically for urban warfare against civilian populations. They're the kind of equipment you deploy when you're planning to turn city streets into battlefields against your own people. Russia didn't send these weapons to help Iran fight a foreign enemy. They sent them to help crush a domestic revolution. Between December 2025 and January 2026, as Iranian security forces were gunning down protesters in the streets, Russian and Belarusian cargo planes were making repeated flights into Tehran. Flight tracking data shows these aircraft taking circuitous routes, deliberately avoiding European airspace, snaking through corridors where their movements would draw less scrutiny. What else was in those cargo holds? We don't know the complete inventory, but intelligence assessments suggest electronic warfare equipment, surveillance technology capable of disrupting satellite internet services, and systems designed to help authoritarian regimes maintain their grip on power when the people rise up against them. This is Russia's playbook. It's what they've done before. It's what they're doing now. And it reveals something crucial about the nature of the alliance between Moscow and Tehran that goes far beyond simple arms deals or diplomatic cooperation. Let's rewind for a moment and understand how we got here. The relationship between Russia and Iran wasn't always this cozy. In fact, for most of modern history, Russia was Iran's adversary, carving off huge chunks of Iranian territory that now make up places like Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. But necessity creates strange partnerships. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia spent the 1990s in chaos and humiliation, and when Iran found itself increasingly isolated by Western sanctions after the 1979 revolution, these two countries discovered they had something powerful in common. They both deeply resented American dominance of the global order. They both faced crushing economic sanctions. And they both needed partners who wouldn't lecture them about human rights or democratic reforms. The partnership really accelerated after 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly Moscow needed weapons, and Iran had them. Tehran began supplying Russia with something that would prove devastatingly effective in the Ukrainian war: drones. Not just any drones, but the Shahed 136, a delta-winged kamikaze drone that could fly hundreds of miles carrying up to 50 kilograms of explosives. These drones became Russia's weapon of choice for terrorizing Ukrainian cities, hitting power plants, hospitals, apartment buildings, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure to break the Ukrainian people's will to resist. Iran didn't just sell Russia these drones. They helped Moscow build an entire factory in Tatarstan to manufacture them domestically. Russian engineers took the Iranian design and improved it, creating the Garand II, their own version, that some experts say surpasses the original. Today, Russia is churning out hundreds of these killing machines every single day. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stood at the World Economic Forum in January 2026 and admitted that Ukraine is producing about 1,000 drones daily, but it's still not enough. Why? Because Russia, with Iranian help, is matching that production and potentially exceeding it. Western intelligence estimates that since October 2021, even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, Iran has sold Russia nearly $3 billion worth of missiles. That's billion with a B. We're talking about ballistic missiles, surface-to-air missiles, hundreds of Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missiles, artillery shells, mortar rounds. The United States Treasury Department has documented that in late 2023, Iran and Russia signed a contract for hundreds of ballistic missiles. By summer 2024, Russian military personnel were in Iran receiving training on how to use these weapons. By September 2024, the first shipments arrived in Russia and were soon being fired at Ukrainian cities. This is the context you need to understand. Iran has been keeping Russia's war machine fed with weapons. So the question becomes, what is Russia giving Iran in return? The answer is more complex and more dangerous than a simple arms-for-arms exchange. It's a comprehensive strategic partnership that touches everything from nuclear technology to space programs to cyber warfare capabilities. And it's accelerating precisely as tensions between the United States and Iran reach a potential breaking point. Let's talk about the nuclear dimension first, because this is where things get really concerning. In April 2025, Russia's upper house of parliament ratified a sweeping 20-year strategic partnership agreement with Iran. This wasn't just a feel-good diplomatic document. It established concrete frameworks for cooperation in military technology, nuclear energy, security coordination, and mechanisms to help both countries evade Western sanctions. The Russian state nuclear company Rosatom signed a $25 billion deal to build multiple nuclear power plants in Iran. Initially, the announcement was for 5 new plants. Then, Iran increased the request to 8. Russia has already built Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, and now they are planning to dramatically expand Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Now, Russia and Iran both insist this is purely civilian nuclear cooperation for peaceful energy production. But here's the problem. The knowledge, technology, and infrastructure used for civilian nuclear programs can be adapted for military purposes. The same enrichment facilities that produce low-enriched uranium for reactor fuel can, with some modifications, produce highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. The same engineers who work on peaceful nuclear projects gain expertise that's directly applicable to weapons programs. And Russia is now positioned as virtually the only major power with deep access to and knowledge of Iran as nuclear facilities. This matters enormously right now because of what happened in summer 2025. In June, after months of failed negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, Israel and the United States launched a coordinated military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. These weren't pinprick attacks. The United States used 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs specifically designed to penetrate deep underground fortifications. The strikes severely damaged Iran's uranium enrichment capabilities. According to Iranian officials, enrichment essentially stopped after these attacks. Hundreds of military personnel and civilians were killed. Iranian nuclear scientists died in these strikes. And where was Russia during this crisis? Conspicuously absent from any meaningful military support. The Kremlin issued some strongly worded statements condemning the attacks, calling them unacceptable aggression, but there were no Russian missiles fired in Iran's defense, no Russian fighter jets scrambling to intercept American bombers, no activation of those advanced S-400 air defense systems that Russia had previously sold to Tehran. Those S-400s, which Russia had marketed as some of the world's most sophisticated anti-aircraft systems, failed to stop the Israeli and American attack. This was a wake-up call for Tehran. The limits of Russian support became crystal clear. Despite the rhetoric about strategic partnership and cooperation, when Iran faced its most serious military crisis in decades, Moscow essentially watched from the sidelines. Why? Because Russia, bogged down in Ukraine, couldn't afford to open another front against the United States and Israel. And more importantly, because Putin calculated that directly confronting America over Iran wasn't worth the risk. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite Russia's failure to provide military protection during those strikes, Iran has not turned away from Moscow. In fact, the relationship has deepened. In October 2025, Ali Larijani, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, personally traveled to Moscow, carrying a message from Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei directly to Vladimir Putin. The contents of that message weren't publicly disclosed, but the symbolism was unmistakable. In Iran's moment of maximum vulnerability, with its nuclear program in ruins and domestic protests threatening the regime's survival, Tehran was reaching out to Moscow for support. What followed tells you everything about what Russia is actually willing to do for Iran. Russia won't send troops to defend Iran against American or Israeli attacks. The 20-year strategic partnership agreement explicitly does not include a mutual defense clause. Russian officials have been very careful to state that this is not a military alliance, and Russia has no obligation to defend Iran if it's attacked. But what Russia will do is provide the tools, technology, and diplomatic cover to help Iran's regime survive internal challenges and rebuild its capabilities. Those armored vehicles that arrived in late 2025 are a perfect example. Russia looked at the protests sweeping Iran and made a calculation. The immediate threat to the Iranian regime wasn't American bombers or Israeli missiles. It was millions of Iranian citizens in the streets demanding change. So Russia sent equipment specifically designed for urban counterinsurgency operations. These Spartak vehicles can withstand improvised explosive devices. protect occupants from small arms fire, and mount heavy weapons for crowd control. They're mobile fortresses for security forces operating in hostile urban environments. Russia has also reportedly provided Iran with electronic warfare systems. There are strong indications that Russian technology is helping Iranian authorities jam Starlink's satellite internet service. Why does this matter? Because during protests and uprisings, communication is everything. Protesters organize through social media and messaging apps. Journalists document government abuses and share them with the world. When traditional internet is shut down, as Iran did in January 2026, cutting off connectivity for days, satellite internet becomes the last lifeline for information flow. Russia has extensive experience in electronic warfare and jamming technologies developed through years of military operations. They're sharing this expertise with Iran to help the regime maintain information control during crises. This is Russia's real value to Iran right now, not as a military protector against external threats, but as a partner in regime survival against internal challenges. Russia sells Iran the tools of repression and the diplomatic cover story that frames protests as foreign interference rather than legitimate domestic grievances. But the relationship flows in both directions, and Russia is extracting significant value beyond the weapons Iran supplies for Ukraine. Russia is gaining unprecedented influence in the Middle East, at a time when American credibility and presence in the region is being questioned. Every contract Russia signs with Iran, every nuclear plant Rosatom builds, every military cooperation agreement they finalize, it all strengthens Russia's position as a power broker in one of the world's eye's most strategically important regions. Consider the nuclear dimension again from Russia's perspective. If Iran eventually decides it needs to reduce its stockpile of highly enriched uranium as part of a deal to ease sanctions and avoid further military strikes, Russia has positioned itself as the country that could take custody of that material. The Kremlin spokesperson explicitly stated in February 2026 that Russia is open to accepting Iranian enriched uranium if it would help de-escalate tensions. This would give Russia enormous leverage. Tehran would be dependent on Moscow's goodwill. Washington would need Russian cooperation for any nuclear agreement with Iran to work. Russia becomes indispensable to any diplomatic resolution. Russia is also leveraging its relationship with both Iran and Israel in fascinating ways. While arming Iran and helping rebuild its capabilities, Moscow has maintained surprisingly constructive relations with Israel. Vladimir Putin has positioned himself as a mediator between Tehran and Tel Aviv. In January 2026, Putin revealed that Israel had sent messages through Russian channels, asking Moscow to convey to Iran that Israel wasn't seeking further confrontation. Iran reportedly responded through the same Russian back channel that it would also refrain from preemptive attacks. This secret communication channel, managed by Russia, shows how Moscow has made itself the essential intermediary in Middle Eastern security arrangements. Think about the strategic brilliance of this position. Russia talks to everyone. They sell weapons to Iran while maintaining diplomatic relations with Israel. They condemn American actions while quietly coordinating with Washington on some issues. They support Iran's nuclear program while also claiming they're working to prevent nuclear proliferation. This flexibility, this ability to play multiple sides, gives Russia influence far beyond what its actual military or economic power in the region would suggest. Now let's talk about what's happening right now in early 2026, because this is where the story gets even more critical. President Donald Trump has revived his maximum pressure campaign against Iran. He's threatening military strikes if Iran does not agree to completely eliminate its uranium enrichment program and dismantle its ballistic missile capabilities. Trump has said that a massive armada is heading toward Iran. He's urged Iranian citizens to rise up and take over institutions, promising that American help is on the way. On January 26, 2026, a U.S. carrier strike group arrived in the region. Trump canceled all meetings with Iranian officials and has imposed a 25% tariff on any country doing business with Iran. Iran is now caught in an impossible situation. Domestically, it just survived the largest protest movement in its modern history. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people were killed when its security forces crushed the demonstrations. The economy is in freefall, with the currency losing 40% of its value in recent months after UN snapback sanctions were reimposed in September. The nuclear program is badly damaged from the June strikes. And now Iran faces the prospect of either accepting humiliating concessions that would essentially mean giving up its strategic deterrent capabilities, or facing another devastating military attack that could finish off what remains of the nuclear program and potentially trigger regime collapse. This is where Russia's role becomes crucial for understanding what happens next. Russia is quietly working diplomatic channels to try to de-escalate the crisis. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said in February 2026 that Russia is continuing contacts with all interested parties and maintains readiness to de-escalate tensions around Iran to the best of its ability. But Russia's definition of de-escalation might not match Washington's. Russia doesn't want to see Iran get nuclear weapons. which would create an unpredictable nuclear-armed power on its southern border. But Russia absolutely does not want to see the Iranian regime collapse and be replaced by a pro-Western government. That would be a catastrophic loss of Russian influence in the region. So Russia is walking a tightrope, trying to convince Iran to make just enough concessions to avoid annihilation while preserving the regime and maintaining Iran as a Russian partner. At the same time, Russia is using the crisis to position itself as the responsible intermediary, the only power that can talk to all sides and find a diplomatic solution. It's classic Russian geopolitical maneuvering, turning weakness in some areas into leverage in others. Whether this Russian strategy ultimately succeeds or fails depends on factors still in play. Can Iran's regime survive the combined pressure of economic warfare, domestic dissent, and military threats? Will Trump actually follow through on threats of military action, or is this all negotiating pressure? Can Russia maintain its balancing act of supporting Iran while avoiding direct confrontation with the United States? Will China become more involved and potentially shift the dynamic? These questions don't have clear answers yet. What we do know is that the partnership between Russia and Iran, forged in the fires of mutual isolation and shared resentment of American power, has become one of the most consequential relationships in contemporary geopolitics. It's enabling Russia's war in Ukraine, it's complicating American strategy in the Middle East, it's advancing nuclear proliferation risks, it's providing a model for how sanctioned states can cooperate to resist Western pressure, and it's reshaping regional power dynamics in ways we're only beginning to understand. As this crisis unfolds through 2026 and beyond, pay attention to what Russia does, not just what it says. The Kremlin is masterful at rhetoric and diplomatic positioning, but the real story is in those cargo flights, those weapons shipments, those technology transfers, those high-level meetings where strategic decisions are made. That's where you see the actual contours of Russian policy rather than the public relations version. The stakes could not be higher. The choices made in Moscow, Tehran, and Washington over the coming months will shape Middle Eastern security for years to come, influence the trajectory of Russia's war in Ukraine, affect global energy markets, and test whether the international community can prevent another devastating regional war. Russia's strategic aid to Iran is not a sideshow. It's central to understanding how this crisis might unfold and what it means for global order. The question isn't whether Russia is sending aid to Iran as tensions rise. That's already happening and well documented. The real question is what comes next when all these pressures reach a breaking point and decisions can no longer be delayed. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is the convergence of multiple crises happening simultaneously. Russia is grinding through its third year of brutal warfare. In Ukraine, with hundreds of thousands of casualties and an economy increasingly militarized and isolated. Iran is facing existential threats from multiple directions at once: external military pressure, internal political instability, economic collapse, and a damaged nuclear program that represented its main deterrent against attack. The United States is navigating a complex Middle East policy under an administration that has shown willingness to use military force unpredictably. The cooperation between Moscow and Tehran in space technology deserves particular attention because it illustrates how comprehensive this partnership has become. In July 2023, CIA Director William Burns publicly highlighted that Russian technicians were working inside Iran on space launch vehicle programs and other aspects of Iranian missile development. This is significant because space launch technology and ballistic missile technology are closely related. By helping Iran improve its space program, Russia is indirectly advancing Iranian missile capabilities that could potentially be used to deliver nuclear weapons if Iran ever crosses that threshold. The financial dimension of this relationship also reveals a lot about how sanctioned states are learning to operate outside the dollar-dominated international financial system. Russia and Iran are pioneering mechanisms for trade that bypass Western banks and payment systems. They're exploring using their own currencies for bilateral trade, rather than dollars or euros. They're developing alternative financial messaging systems to replace SWIFT. They're using front companies, shell corporations, and circuitous routing to move money and goods while evading detection and enforcement of sanctions. This matters far beyond just Russia and Iran. If these two countries successfully demonstrate that major economies can function while essentially locked out of the Western financial system, it undermines one of the main tools the United States uses to enforce its foreign policy preferences. Sanctions only work if there's no alternative. Russia and Iran are building that alternative. Not perfectly, and not without significant economic cost. But they're proving it can be done. China is watching this experiment very carefully. The propaganda and information warfare dimensions are also crucial, but often overlooked. Russia has invested heavily in media and information operations, increasing funding for state-run media and influence campaigns by 54% in its 2026 budget, adding $458 million. Some of this capacity is being shared with or deployed on behalf of Iran. When protests erupted in Iran, Russian state media downplayed the coverage and echoed Iranian government claims that the demonstrations were being orchestrated by foreign interference. Think about the infrastructure projects connecting these countries as well. Russia and Iran are both invested in the International North-South Transport Corridor, a massive undertaking designed to create a multimodal transportation network linking Russia to Iran to India, bypassing traditional routes through the Suez Canal. Progress has been slow, but the strategic vision is clear. Create alternative infrastructure that doesn't depend on Western-controlled systems. The energy sector represents another key area of cooperation with global implications. Russia is one of the world's largest oil and gas producers. Iran has massive energy reserves, but has struggled to fully develop them under sanctions. Russian energy companies have the expertise and technology to help Iran exploit its resources more effectively. When Russia and Iran coordinate on energy production and exports, they can significantly impact global prices, giving them economic leverage that translates into geopolitical power. Consider what happened after the June 2025 strikes that devastated Iran's nuclear facilities. Russian advisors apparently encouraged Iran to play for time, to rebuild what was destroyed, to use diplomatic channels, to reduce immediate pressure while quietly reconstituting capabilities. Russia offered to help with the rebuilding process. Russia also activated its diplomatic networks to try to create breathing room for Iran. This approach serves Russian interests perfectly. Russia doesn't want Iran to collapse, but Russia also doesn't want Iran to do something reckless that triggers a regional war. Looking ahead, several specific developments deserve close monitoring. First, watch whether those Su-35 fighter jets actually get delivered on schedule. If Russia follows through despite international pressure, it demonstrates Moscow is willing to defy the West significantly. Second, monitor the nuclear plant construction projects. Third, watch Russian diplomatic positioning in international forums. Fourth, pay attention to any technology transfers related to advanced missiles or air defense systems. Fifth, observe how Russia responds if there's another major attack on Iran. The wild card in all of this is how China factors into the equation. China is Iran's largest trading partner and has enormous economic interests in Iranian oil. China is also Russia's most important partner, the economic lifeline keeping Russia's economy functioning despite Western sanctions. If China decides that the Russia-Iran partnership is too destabilizing, Beijing has leverage to influence both Moscow and Tehran. Conversely, if China decides that a strong Russia-Iran axis serves Chinese interests by tying down American resources in the Middle East, Beijing's support could make the partnership even stronger. What is undeniable is that the world we're living in now looks fundamentally different from the immediate post-Cold War period, when American power seemed unchallengeable. Multiple powers are now capable of pursuing independent foreign policies even when Washington objects. They can find partners willing to trade and cooperate despite sanctions. They can develop military capabilities that make intervention against them extremely costly. And they can use information operations, cyber warfare, and asymmetric strategies to complicate American military advantages. This shift didn't happen overnight. It's been building for years through thousands of decisions, large and small. Every cargo plane Russia sends to Iran represents one of those decisions, a choice to deepen the partnership despite the risks and costs. Every nuclear cooperation agreement, every weapon sale, every diplomatic coordination, they're all moves in a long game of reshaping global power structures. For people trying to make sense of global affairs in 2026, understanding the Russia-Iran relationship is absolutely essential. You cannot understand the war in Ukraine without recognizing that Iranian weapons are sustaining Russia's offensive operations. You cannot understand the nuclear crisis with Iran without recognizing that Russia is helping rebuild capabilities and providing diplomatic cover. You cannot understand Middle Eastern security dynamics without factoring in Russian influence through its Iranian partnership. The script we're watching unfold didn't have to turn out this way. Different choices at critical moments over the past several decades could have produced different outcomes. If the United States had pursued different policies toward Russia after the Cold War ended, perhaps the antagonism driving current Russian behavior could have been avoided. If the international community had found better ways to integrate Iran into global institutions, perhaps Tehran wouldn't have become so dependent on partnerships with revisionist powers, but those choices weren't made, and now we're dealing with the consequences. Russia and Iran have built a partnership that serves both their interests and challenges American strategy. Whether this partnership ultimately succeeds in achieving its goals or collapses under its own contradictions remains to be seen. What's certain is that it will be one of the defining factors shaping international affairs for years to come. The cargo planes flying through the darkness are just the visible manifestation of a deeper transformation in how power operates in the 21st century. And understanding that transformation is essential for anyone trying to navigate the increasingly complex and dangerous world we all inhabit.